Hey everyone, this is a second PowerPoint about the rise and fall of disco, and in this one I want to talk about the disco club Studio 54 and the film Saturday Night Fever and its accompanying soundtrack. Came out in 1977 and dramatically expanded the audience for disco. So let's jump in. Studio 54 became the most famous club of the disco era, located in Lower Manhattan in New York City. As it became more famous, it was mentioned in a number of disco hits, and it became the place to be seen for celebrities the late 70s. Actors, musicians, rock and pop music stars hung out there regularly. Of course, they had their own separate entrance. They didn't have to contend with the crowds that you see in this picture, jammed outside the front door at 3 a.m. So, for other people who weren't celebrities, you had to literally be picked out of the crowd to enter the club. There would be this velvet rope stretched in front of the doors, manned by somebody who would select people from the crowd. Often the person doing that was a guy named Steve Rubell, who was one of the co-owners. So for people who embraced disco, the glamour that they saw Studio 54 representing became viewed as part of the excitement of the disco music scene. For critics, this was snobbish exclusivity, mandating that people had to have the right look, the right clothes, the right shoes, the right hairstyle in order to be selected to go in and mingle with the beautiful people. So it became one of the controversial elements of the club. Now, of course, not every disco in the United States operated like this, but it's one of the reasons that Studio 54 became a source of controversy. The disco movement brought heightened visibility to gays and lesbians as DJs, as producers, as performers. I'm going to say a little more about that on the next slide too. But the fact that Studio 54 was accepting and welcoming of gays and lesbians was something that caused controversy at the time. Another element of the disco music scene was that the rise in popularity of disco coincided with expanded use of the drug cocaine. Now, cocaine had been around for a long time, but its use broadened considerably in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Its addictive properties weren't understood, and cocaine is going to end up cutting a very broad, destructive path through the film industry, the music industry, and through sports at both the college and professional levels. Studio 54 in particular, use of cocaine was quite common on the dance floor, and one of the ideas that club owners Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager came up with that they thought would bring people kind of a laugh was to have what you see in the picture, this man in the moon with a Coke spoon to its nose, lower over the dance floor at midnight. And so not only was the use of cocaine not hidden or discouraged at Studio 54, it was openly celebrated as part of the fun and excitement of the disco lifestyle. Now, I mentioned in that slide Studio 54 being welcoming of gays and lesbians into the club, and that the rise of disco music coincided with the gay lesbian liberation movements of the 1970s, which can be traced back to the event that Eric Foner mentioned briefly in the reading that you did, the so-called Stonewall Uprising. Grew out of this raid by New York City police of the Stonewall Inn, a gay club in New York City in 1969. And in this particular incident, patrons fought back and resisted arrest. And it really launched the gay and lesbian rights movement of the 1970s. So in disco, gays and lesbians and transgendered people had heightened visibility as I mentioned DJs, as producers, and as performers. Probably the best known gay group of the disco era was this band, the Village People, that projected a very campy image and scored huge hits with their songs YMCA in the Navy. This is a complicated issue to talk about because at the time there were people who understood what was going on with the Village People and their hit songs and saw them as liberating, celebratory. Um, Other people found it objectionable, and then there were other people for whom this went completely over their heads. I'm convinced today, I mean, YMCA is still a very popular song. Sporting events played at Busch Stadium. I'm convinced there are a lot of people today who still don't understand what's going on in these songs. You have to listen to the lyrics carefully. They're catchy, clever songs, but they were misunderstood by many folks at the time and since. I mean, even when it was a hit, a lot of people thought In the Navy was really this patriotic call to enlist in the U.S. Navy. So as they say, it's a complicated issue. Some people got it, some people didn't. And for some of those who did, this gay subtext of the disco scene was something that they found objectionable. Now, I want to say just a few things about the film and soundtrack Saturday Night Fever, because this is going to have a tremendous impact and vastly expand disco's audience. The quick backstory for this is that there was a freelance writer named Nick Cohn who primarily covered rock and pop music, and in 1976 he gets this assignment from New York Magazine to cover the disco scene in New York City, which he didn't really know much about. So in talking to people who were more knowledgeable to get some guidance on how to do research, several people told Nick Cohn, they said, don't go to one of these larger, more famous discos. You need to go to one of the smaller, working class discos to get a better understanding of what's happening with this phenomenon. So several people mentioned a particular club in Brooklyn, Club Odyssey 2001 Disco, and that's where he decides to go. So he gets a cab driver to take him there. He's getting a little more apprehensive as they go deeper into this neighborhood, which was somewhat run down. Finally arrive in front of this Odyssey Disco, and just as he's getting ready to get out of the cab, he sees that there's this fight going on the sidewalk right where the cab driver's pulled up. So he hesitantly decides to get out of the cab, and right when he's getting out, there's this whole group of young guys brawling. One of them gets punched in the stomach, vomits all over Nick Cohn's leg. So he dives back into the cab, tells the cab driver, get me out of here. And as the cab's pulling away, he looks out the back window. He sees that this fight's still going on, but away from the fight, near the entrance to the club, leaning against the side of the building, silhouetted under a street light, there's this guy dressed very sharply in disco outfit, open neck disco shirt, chains, calmly smoking a cigarette. And Cohn thinks, boy, that guy looks cool. If I could have talked to him, I probably would have learned a lot. And he decides to make that person the centerpiece of a story that he completely makes up. This whole essay is totally fabricated, but it's published under the title Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night, and it gains a lot of attention. One of the people who reads it is a film producer and a music manager named Robert Stigwood, who was managing a group at the time, the Bee Gees. And Stigwood reads this article, thinks it would be a great source for a film. I should probably have a parental warning for this slide. This shows you what the Bee Gees transformed into once they became popular. The Bee Gees were a group of brothers, the Gibb brothers from Australia, who at this point were a trio, but are going to be joined by their younger brother, Andy Gibb, and become a quartet. But they had had a series of hits in the late 60s and early 70s. Not a ton, but a few hits. I guess I would describe them mainly as kind of teenage makeout songs, slower songs, like How Can You Mend a Broken Heart was one of theirs. So they had some success and then just kind of disappeared. And then they signed a new contract in 1975 with a new label, started a comeback recording disco-influenced music. They were heavily influenced, especially by Casey and the Sunshine Band. So the Bee Gees were in France working on a new album, and Robert Stigwood contacts them and says, I purchased the rights to this story that I'm going to transform into a movie, and I want you to start writing songs for it. The movie was just barely in production, starting to be cast. And so the Bee Gees know very little other than Stigwood tells them it's going to be about this working class kid who lives in Brooklyn, whose life centers around getting dressed up, going out and dancing on Saturday night. That's it. So they start writing songs for a movie they haven't seen, of course, because it's just barely in production, starts filming. In fact, filming had started before they even finished all the songs. And incredibly, this music, the songs they composed, are going to end up fitting the film perfectly. I love this photograph from a premiere party for Saturday Night Fever because you have in the left of the picture Robert Stigwood looking happy and excited, John Travolta on the right, who played the main character, Tony Manero, and this film is going to launch Travolta to stardom. He looks excited, and beside Travolta, looking utterly bewildered, Nick Cone, who looks as if he's still wondering, how did I get in this situation? He was paid 6 figures for the rights to this article that he had completely made up. That didn't come out till several years later when Cone finally admitted in an interview that he had fabricated the whole thing. So the movie and the soundtrack, Saturday Night Fever, film was tremendously popular. The soundtrack became a huge hit. Multiple hit singles come from it. It transformed the Bee Gees from a group struggling to make a comeback. It transformed them into superstars. And as I say in the slide, this brought disco to a much broader, primarily white audience. Up to this point, disco had been seen really as kind of niche music, primarily black music. Of course, there were white listeners who liked it too, but Saturday Night Fever really mainstreams it and makes it much more acceptable to middle America. Disco music becomes not just a part of the top 40, but after Saturday Night Fever, it becomes dominant in the top 40. At one point, the Bee Gees had 5 songs, 5 singles in the top 10 on the Billboard Top 40 charts. Nobody had done that since the Beatles. And this is the point where critics of disco, traditional rock music fans, become increasingly alarmed. And as we'll see in the final PowerPoint, there's going to be a backlash develop against disco music.